Lina mai ina mea ho'olohe, mai Hawaii a Kauai, mai Maui a Molokai. Aloha mai kākou. Start recording. Okay. O le paka watman ko inoa, a he lalau wau o ka pula ho'oko o ola ho'olu paimoko, Retreat Hawaii. Eia mai ke manawa na awa ana hoi hoi, a ho'opi hoi hoi no hoi. E pili ana I ka ho'olilo ana I ke aniau, I ka hano ke kanaka, a me he aha ko kako hana e ho emi ai I ke kalapona o ki kene lua. Welcome to this online climate crisis forum, organized by La Ho'olu Paimoku, Retreat Hawaii, to look into the very serious threats of climate change to our islands, but also what we can and should be doing to address those threats. My name is Rob Weltman, and we have with us this evening a number of speakers representing Hawaii's climate experts, conservationists, climate conscious politicians, and youth activists. I'll ask you to type your questions and comments into the Facebook Live comment area or the YouTube Live chat channel, and we will have our panel address as many of them as we can after their presentations. Our first speaker this evening is Tim Botkin. Tim holds a JD from the University of Oklahoma and a master's in sustainability management from James Madison University and from the University of Malta. At the University of Hawaii, Maui College, he is coordinator of the Sustainable Science Management BAS program, sponsor of the Student Ohana for Sustainability, sits on the Campus Sustainability Committee, and is Policy and Procedure Committee Chair, and teaches sustainability. His background includes work in environmental law, mediation, elected office holder, and as sustainability consultant. Please take it away, Tim.
Hello, Rob, and to everybody who put this on. It's really good to see and to get a chance to talk openly about where we are, what we need to do. Much of it specific to Hawaii and Maui, other knowing that we're dealing with global concerns as well. So with that, I'm going to start with some basics because I want to be sure that we're kind of all on the same page. The issue that we have here in climate change is obviously one that affects all of us, but not necessarily equally. And at the same time, it is caused more by some than others. Unfortunately, we're in a position in Hawaii where we are affected more than most, but we certainly don't cause the effect as much as most. So we're kind of getting the downside of each. Now, my slideshow doesn't look good on my end. How's it doing on your end, Rob?
Looks fine. Oh, actually, you're still showing the thumbnails on the side.
Yeah, so I'm not sure why it's not letting me do much of what I want to do here, but I can't even get my cursor to work. All right, I'm not going to fiddle around with it. I don't think anything is that critical to keep us from having our conversation. So here, what I wanted to start with is making sure that we all understand how climate change comes to be. I think too many of us see it as kind of an amorphous thing. We know it has to do with carbon, et cetera, but we don't ever sit and think about how it works. I'm showing this slide first, and then the second slide will be the carbon cycle, which is kind of the driver for this conversation as we go. But as you see in this slide, the sun brings all of our heat to us. Otherwise, we'd be a dark and cold place. That heat then is transferred through our atmosphere. The sun and the photons from the sun travel at a very high speed through outer space. There's nothing to slow them down. They hit our atmosphere and slow down somewhat, and then they bounce onto the Earth as they get through the atmosphere. And some bounce up, some are absorbed, and some are trapped. They slow down after they bounce. They become more akin to just plain infrared heat, which really doesn't have near the power and velocity of the ultraviolet, which comes in the first place. So that heat then is trapped within our atmosphere. And in our atmosphere, the functions which really cause this to happen are called the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is the amount of certain particles from certain substances that collect in the atmosphere and in fact get in the way of the solar rays bouncing back off the Earth and stay home. The more of those particles that are there, the tighter the greenhouse blanket, the more the greenhouse effect, and the more we hold heat, and therefore leading to what we originally called global warming. And it is in fact global warming. Even though it doesn't warm everywhere at the same time, it does warm the Earth. So the question about greenhouse effect, though, it's important to note is it's not a bad thing. It is also the thing which has moderated our climate for millions of years, which have made our life to grow as it has, including humans, including everything we see, because it's been able to rely on the fact that we have a fairly reasonably steady greenhouse effect, greenhouse blanket over the years. And in that context, life has been able to mutate, evolve so that it matches up with the climate that we've been given. When we look then at the next slide based upon climate or carbon cycle, this is where carbon recycles throughout the planet, mostly in the biosphere and then into the atmosphere. You can see that the generally, the areas that see the most happening are in the sea, where the ocean actually absorbs carbon and phytoplankton conducts photosynthesis. They also die and decompose. So the amount that comes into the sea and the amount that goes over out of the sea are roughly the same. If you go to the terrestrial body, you'll see the same thing occurs. We have plants growing, plants conducting, plants dying. As plants grow, they conduct photosynthesis, which pulls in most of the carbon dioxide that we have coming out of the atmosphere. And it's really the only mechanism that, along with that in the seaborne conditions, which does pull down carbon from the atmosphere and bring it back to Earth. At the same time, plants also respire, and they also decompose along with other parts of our system. So you see another balance over here, 120 with photosynthesis, and then 60 plus 60 from respiration and decomposition. Same over here. It's this pair of equilibrium or equilibria that have existed on the planet for so long, and that equilibrium does not change radically or quickly at all. It has changed over time, but in the course of time that allows life and other Earth's processes to change along with it. What we're seeing now, though, is this what seems to be relatively small, you'd think, only 9, and these are gigatons of carbon being emitted by human activities. Now, on the one hand, you think, well, wait a minute, we've got 120 and 60 over here and 90. So 9, that's not a big deal. Why would we worry about that? The problem is there, you don't see an offset. You don't see an arrow bringing that back down. This has to rely on what's going on over here or here, and these are already pretty well taken up. So what happens is if roughly you take this 9 and you say, well, some's coming in and out and so forth, the overall net annual increase is around 4 gigatons per year. Now, I am really sorry to say that this slide doesn't give us the number for what's in the atmosphere, but I can assure you that it said 800 gigatons. Some say 750, it's around that number. So what this means is that on an annual basis, roughly 4 gigatons are being added to the greenhouse blanket that is causing our warming. And again, okay, that's not so much. That's, a very small amount of 800. But the problem is it doesn't come back down. So we have to say, well, wait a minute, this has been going on 100 years, 140 years. Now we're talking about 400 or 500 gigatons that have been added to the atmosphere during the last 120 years. And that is what is causing the problem. The rest of that, it has to do with the fact that this is happening so quickly that evolution and natural processes cannot stay up with it. So you look at the graph, which I did not bring today, and it shows, are you guys not even seeing my slides? I'm just looking up. What are you guys seeing, Rob?
Yeah, we're seeing the slides. It's just we're seeing the thumbnails too.
Okay, good. All right. I'm sorry about that. But this is happening so quickly that on a graph, it looks like almost a straight vertical exponential growth. And it's been in that condition for quite some time, and it hasn't changed as we've gone well over 400, I think in 15 now, ppm as the number that really drives the show. Okay, so coming back to the role of forestation, you can see plants and forests are huge players overall. Phytoplankton and other sea critters over here also doing some work. But on land, the 120 and the photosynthesis is the driver of stability. It's pretty much overtaxed though at this point. So the question is, what can we do? Can we plant more things to increase the photosynthesis effect to the point that, yes, we're really making a difference in bringing climate change back into play? So if we look at another smaller scale version, there's also what's called the forest cycle, which is also a carbon cycle. And you can see that forests do take up and store in their trunks, in their limbs, in their leaves, in their roots, all of this carbon on a continual basis. That's what photosynthesis done. It's the magic of converting carbon dioxide into woody fibers as things come along. It takes that energy to do so. But then over time, trees give up their carbon as well, whether they die and decompose or whether they even burn. Certainly, our natural carbon cycle allows for some forest burning because it does happen in natural conditions. We may be experiencing a little more of that, thanks to climate change anyway. But the bottom line, this is again something of an equilibrium. So it is for that reason that just by planting trees, it doesn't just take in carbon and not do anything else. It takes in the carbon and builds things with it. And then when it dies, it gives some back. That's the nature of the carbon cycle. That's the nature of what we're dealing with. So when you look at these things, we really are victims of scale and globalization and inequity with regard to impacts because we do not have the landmass or the people to, for instance, cause enough emissions to change climate change. And we do not necessarily have the landmass to change a global thing like climate change appreciably by what we do on our islands. At the same time, the concept of reforestation is incredibly important for many, many reasons, carbon being one. So I love this quote by Ralph Hosmer, who was one of our early foresters and for whom Hosmer Grove is named up on Haleakala. In Hawaii, the most valuable product of the forest is water rather than wood. Now that's just a kind of an inkling of the fact that having forests place so many indirect benefits to what we have and what we do that they are critical both to maintain, to protect, and to build back. Maui, Hawaii, across the world has so many scars left from early humans and even later humans who have made such an easy habit of cutting forests, leaving denuded areas, changing the ecosystem radically, and even changing the water systems. We've seen many civilizations, the Mayans, the Egyptians, both of whom suffered tremendous loss in their civilization because they polluted their water system by cutting too many forests and watching the hillsides erode and clog the water systems that they had at the time. So in this light, there is no question that reforestation has the benefits that justify it at any level. It's always the right thing. And it's critical to note that one of the big things that forests do is it acts as a carbon sink. It draws carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and holds it for quite some time before releasing it upon the death of the vegetation. With that in mind, I think we have to also say from a scientific standpoint, and please, let's stay with the scientific standpoint these days and when we like to make things up. But let's stick with the fact that photosynthesis through forests is a role player, but not the only role player in terms of that carbon cycle. And the amount that we can actually do doesn't hold up in terms of just the math, but in terms of the propriety of it, in terms of the value of it, there is so much more to help us understand why it makes so much sense that there's no question about it. At the same time, when we talk about climate change, we have so many other things that go along with our responsibility to try to see what happens. And we certainly cannot take our eye off the requirement that we reduce emissions, that being the thing that really needs to happen to get our functions back to where they should be. So this is a critical effort. It is more than just commendable. It's something that needs to be done for our ecosystems overall. We need to be able to show the world that this can be done, show the world that it is beneficial, and that if we all did it, we would start to see more of an appreciable benefit, even in terms of the numbers. So this is full speed ahead. Maui is one of the best places on the planet to demonstrate what we can do as a community to improve things that we have not quite paid enough attention to in the past. So I really appreciate the effort of this group to begin with this. I appreciate the effort of so many who've been up there on the hillside planting trees. It's something we want to continue to do, both for our island and our state and for the world in terms of understanding what our obligations really are. So I thank you for that and look forward to hearing the rest of the speakers this evening.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was Tim Boutkin. And for those people who are just joining right now, I want to share what this is about. So this is Paho'olupaimoku, Retreat Hawaii, organizing a forum on the climate crisis, how it's threatening Hawaii and what we are doing, should be doing, could be doing to mitigate it. And you can find out more and you can sign up to plant at retreathawaii.org/planting. Our next speaker is Chip Fletcher, well known to many who follow climate issues. Dr. Chip Fletcher is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Earth Sciences at the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology, University of Hawaii at Manoa. He also serves on the Honolulu Climate Change Commission. And there you go, Chip. I think you're still muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. Can you hear me okay?
It's fine.
Okay, great. So let me dive in. I have a lot to say. We have so far warmed the planet as a result of our land use and release of greenhouse gas emissions about 1.2 degrees C above the pre-industrial level. And at this rather low amount of global warming, we see a very startling reaction in many of Earth's systems. Antarctic ice melt has tripled over the past 5 years. Greenland melting has quadrupled. Greenland and West Antarctica are now irreversibly melting. That hopefully will play out over 1,000 years unless we engage in some dramatic warming, in which case it'll speed up. There's a 5% probability of sea level rise reaching 6.5 feet by this century. We see a 12% global increase in extreme rainfall and a 10% increase in drought. We now have 2/3 of humanity facing a water shortage for at least 1 month each year. Over 33 million people were displaced from their homes last year, largely by extreme weather events, and climate change played a role in 70% of these cases. Impoverished women from typically developing countries, but not exclusively, are 14 times more likely to die from a climate-fueled disaster than men are. And the Syrian conflict that gave rise to ISIS has changed the political face of Europe, started because of a 1,000-year drought that collapsed farming in that nation. That drought was made 2 to 3 times more likely by climate change. Annually, extreme weather disasters cause more than 60,000 deaths. And IAG, the insurance giant, said that failure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions could result in a world that is uninsurable, with poorer communities bearing the largest burden. The truth is that renewable energy is not replacing fossil fuels. It's actually helping fossil fuels meet the demand for new energy. And last year, as has been true for every year, the fossil fuels supplying global energy, global power, have grown faster than renewable energy sources of power. And projections by energy economists are all in uniform agreement that we're looking at continued CO2 emissions, although there's some flattening out to mid-century. Now, if we want to stop warming at the Paris targets of 1.5 and 2.0 degrees, it's that green arrow that is the pathway that we need to follow for CO2 emissions. And a nonpartisan congressional think tank that's been around since the 1950s, in their outlook for last year, 2019, stated that global energy consumption will grow 20 to 30% or more through 2040 and beyond, led largely by fossil fuels. So the current trend is not good. This is the history of CO2 emissions since 1850. And this is what CO2 emissions need to do if we are to stop warming at 1.5 degrees C, the Paris target. We need to hit zero emissions by 2065, 15 years later, if we want to stop at 2 degrees C. And we're not done. Then we need to remove CO2 from the air, called sequestration, for the next several centuries. And we have only begun to spin up that infrastructure of sequestration. The truth is, renewable energy provides only 10% of global energy right now. The International Energy Agency found energy demand set to grow by more than 25% by 2040. And they stated renewables make up only 2/3 of new capacity, and oil consumption grows due to rising demand for basically plastics, trucking, aviation, and energy every year. If existing sources of fossil fuel emissions like factories, cars, and power plants simply continue to operate for their expected lifetime, this would result in 55% more emissions than allowable for the 1.5 degree C target. And fossil fuel producing nations have announced plans to produce 50% more fossil fuels at the end of this decade than is compatible with stopping at 2 degrees C. Coal is the largest source of energy generation globally, and it accounts for 36% of global power generation. China is building more new coal plants than the rest of the world combined. India is opening 41 new coal plants as part of its post-COVID recovery plans. And renewable energy is not rising as fast as the use of fossil fuels. To get to net zero by 2050, the world requires 2020-like reductions in carbon emissions every other year for the next 25 years. And what we've seen this year is projected to be 7.5% to 8% reduction in emissions because of the very, very deep recession caused by the pandemic. So this can only be achieved by a radical shift in our behaviors, and COVID has done just that. The question is, what will the post-COVID economy look like? Will it come roaring back on fossil fuels? Will it come back slower on renewables? Or is COVID here to stay as a condition that suppresses economic growth? This is the pathway that we are on, warming between 3 and 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. This is a very dangerous amount of warming. And if you look at these black locations in the middle of the Sahara Desert, they represent 1% of Earth's land surface. And those locations are too hot for human existence without air conditioning. But at continued emissions, those climate conditions will expand to 20% of the land surface. And we're looking at 1 out of every 3 people on the planet having to move because they would be in these intolerable conditions. So climate refugee problem has already begun. We see it at the continental US southern border. We see it in the European Union, and it is something that's likely and is projected to grow considerably. Many people don't realize that our food grown under higher levels of CO2 is less nutritious. And a good example of this is wheat, which currently provides 20% of all human protein. But the yield is threatened by climate-related factors like drought, flood, and higher CO2. By mid-century, the demand for wheat is projected to increase by 60%, and the yield is projected to actually decline by 15%. This is a recipe for food shortages as well as nutritional shortages. It's projected that by mid-century, an additional 300 million people will be malnourished because of the CO2 effect, and 1.4 billion women and children likely to have iron deficiency. We also have a freshwater crisis. In the US, in the continental US, freshwater is withdrawn from aquifers 17% more than nature can replace every year. And many other nations are doing the same thing. China is withdrawing 22% more fresh water from aquifers than can be replaced. India, 52%, and the Middle East and North Africa, over 1,000%. By mid-century, water demand is projected to grow by 55%, while we are unsustainably reducing water resources. Food shortages, water shortages, these can lead to violent conflict even among the refugees. We are also driving the natural world towards extinction. This paper states that the world is increasingly managed to maximize the flow of material contributions from nature to keep up with rising demands for food, energy, timber, and more, with global trade increasing the geographic separation between supply and demand. This unparalleled appropriation of nature is causing the fabric of life on which humanity depends to fray and unravel. Climate change amplifies the problem of overpopulation on our planet. Humans have altered 75% of the world's lands, destroyed 85% of wetlands, engineered more than 75% of the longest rivers, and eliminated 40% of the original forests on this planet. Just today, some research came out that 40% of the world's plant species are at risk of extinction. Since 1970, the per person consumption has increased 45%. That's each of us needing 45% more stuff. And GDP has grown by 300%. Extraction of living materials from nature has grown 200% over that 50-year period. Global trade has grown by 900%. All of this on a planet that has not grown. In fact, habitat loss, the majority of habitat loss can be chalked up to beef agriculture as well as palm oil. Over the last 50 years, food crop production has increased 300%, and half of all agriculture expansion has come at the expense of forests. We have destroyed an area the size of Africa in order to grow animals for eating. We're deforesting the planet at a rate of 30 football fields per minute, largely to raise cattle and the grain to feed them. 43% of all ice and desert-free land, 2/3 of all freshwater use is for food production. Over 80% of farmland is used for livestock, but it produces only 18% of food calories and 37% of protein. Cattle and the grain they eat use 1/3 of the available land surface on this planet, 16% of available fresh water. 1/3 of worldwide grain production goes to cattle. Producing beef generates 100 times more greenhouse gas than plant-based food. And we feed cattle with hybridized corn and soy that is raised using synthetic pesticides and nutrients, responsible for 78% of the world's coastal dead zones. We plow the soil, we turn it over and expose all the carbon in the soil to the air so that it finds oxygen and actually releases CO2 into the atmosphere. And it dries and it erodes into the nearest watershed. Of all mammals on Earth, 96% by biomass are livestock and humans. 4% are wild. Of all birds, 70% are chickens and other poultry, only 30% are wild. We are raising animals in factory farms, which is leading to the spread of disease. And 2/3 of all medicine produced in this country goes to keep those animals, pork, poultry, and beef, alive because of the disease that spreads through their herds in factory farms. We also have new phenomenon that we had not identified before about 10 years ago, marine heat waves. There's been a 54% increase in them. And a lot of the increase in temperature here in Hawaii is because of rising sea surface temperatures. In fact, last summer, we had over 300 record-setting temperatures in Hawaii. On Kauai, August was the hottest month on record. In Honolulu, August 31st tied the all-time record high in Hawaii of 95 degrees, or in Honolulu. On Maui, 97 degrees in July, on July 29th of last year, maybe the highest temperature ever measured in Hawaii. And in Hilo, August was the hottest month on record, along with 15 days of record highs. We see declining rain across Hawaii. The average rate of decline is 6% per decade across the state. And we see daily wind speeds declining and coming more from the east. Trade winds coming now from the east are bringing air from roughly the same latitude as Hawaii, and so it is warmer and it interacts with our topography in ways that produces fewer clouds and less precipitation. But we do have rain bombs, and we set a national record of 49.69 inches of rain in a 24-hour period during a storm system that first hit the south shore of Oahu and then moved on to Kauai. Hanalei River rose 15 feet, jumped its bank, and carved a new channel to the sea. We also know that hurricanes are changing in ways that are more dangerous for Hawaii. They're larger, stronger, wetter, they move slower, they're intensifying faster, and they are shifting away from the equator towards the latitude of Hawaii. Let's look very quickly at the hurricanes of the last 6 years. In the red circle is our state. These are the tropical cyclones from 2015, 2016, 2017, we got a reprieve, 2018, 2019, and Hurricane Douglas this year. So we have dodged a bullet. We will be hit by a devastating high category hurricane. It's just a matter of time. We also know that we are losing the Antarctic ice sheet, and that deep red area is irreversibly melting in West Antarctica. And research came out this summer saying that this cluster of glaciers in West Antarctica, Thwaites and Pine Island Glacier, are showing new damage areas representing structural weakening, a precondition for these ice shelves to disintegrate. Greenland is losing mass as well, and research late this spring indicated or concluded that Greenland is irreversibly melting as well. So it'd be nice if we could wait for the science to clear up on how high sea level will rise this century, but coastal decision-making and development needs to happen now. And so a statistical survey among glaciologists was run, and the conclusion was that there's a 1 in 20 to a 1 in 10 chance of sea level exceeding 6.5 feet this century. Sea level rise is going to be very impactful on Maui. The bright blue line is portions of highway that will be flooded or eroded under 3.2 feet of sea level rise. Here's the Kihei coast, and you see new wetlands forming inland of South Kihei Road, as well as coastal erosion in the red line. And this is already taking place on our beaches. This is 1 week old drone footage of Rocky Point on Sunset Beach, Oahu. We have over 30 homes that now have geotextile cloth protecting them, preventing them from being undermined by erosion. The beach is gone in front of these homes, and you just have a total mess of this iconic world famous beach. Our modeling projects that under 2 feet of sea level rise on Ewa Beach on the south shore of Oahu, we see a few dozen homes inundated every summer. This is not storm waves, this is surf swell that comes in every summer. But under 3 feet, 3.2 feet of sea level rise every summer, the entire community of Ewa Beach will be flooded by waves. We can project with our modeling wave flooding, highways that are impacted, and 80 percentile coastal erosion probability. What are the solutions to this problem? Stay informed, follow climate change news. I follow Carbon Brief, the Daily Climate, and Inside Climate News. We need to achieve some social tipping points where it's recognized that we need to remove fossil fuel subsidies and begin strongly incentivizing renewable energy much more than we have. People need to accept the morally harmful nature of fossil fuels. We need to focus on building carbon neutral cities, divesting from assets linked to fossil fuels, strengthening climate education and engagement, and including carbon footprints in purchases right next to the price tag. Pricing the true cost of carbon is going to be important. Regenerative ag, which allows our agriculture fields to store carbon dioxide rather than release it to the atmosphere, has the potential all alone to solve this problem. By 2050, if every ag field in the world used regenerative agriculture. And I'll end with the strongest things that any of us can do as individuals is to eat a more plant-based diet, talk about climate change, follow the climate news on a daily basis, and vote the environment and the climate. Join collective community action as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chip, for those encouraging and bright words. Put us right in the mood for our next speaker. But before I do that, I wanted to share, for those who have just joined, who we are. This is the La'aulu Paimoku, Retreat Hawaii, and our big event that we're working towards right now is statewide tree planting day, October 30th. And you can go to retreathawaii.org/planting to see all the sites and pick one near you and sign up to go plant on October 30th. So now that Chip has set up the plate for the politicians to take care of this mess, our next speaker is Kelly King. She is Maui County Councilmember, Kelly Takaya King, and she chairs the Council's Climate Action and Resilience Committee and represents Maui County and the Executive Board of the Hawaii State Association of Counties. She's also the Vice President of Pacific Biodiesel Technologies, a pioneering renewable fuel company she co-founded with her husband in 1995, a lifetime member of the Sierra Club, and has also just been installed as the newest board member of the ICLEI, the Local Governments for Sustainability, an international organization of local and regional governments that have made a commitment to sustainable development. So what can we expect from our politicians to address these dire problems?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate that intro. And I appreciate so much the two presentations that came before me, because I just, in my meeting this week, just yesterday, had Chip Fletcher on to do a presentation, and we didn't give him enough time to finish the whole thing. So I really enjoyed seeing the full collection of his slides, even though it was a little depressing to hear how few wild animals we have left. But thank you to Tim Bodkin for the plea for science, please, science. And I'll share my screen now and go to, if I can get my presentation up, it worked earlier. Okay, so you said most of this, I don't need to spend a whole lot of time. I did want to, on this slide, talk about the Sustainable Biodiesel Alliance that I started with Willie and Annie Nelson and Daryl Hanna, some other advocates and some folks in the biofuel industry back in the mid-2000s, because I really was paying attention when Chip Fletcher talked about the rainforests and the planting of palm plantations. So the Sustainable Biodiesel Alliance, because my husband and I had been at the forefront of the biodiesel industry, was created to address exactly that problem. We had, it hit home because we had a large organization that's trying to come into Hawaii and Maui specifically to start importing 100 million gallons of palm oil from the Indonesian rainforest area, because the rainforest was being burnt down and cut down and palm plantations were being planted. So I wanted to touch on that. That organization lasted about 10 years and it got retired with the dwindling biodiesel industry, because some of the big corporations were just kind of coming in and buying everybody out. So the small community-based models were flailing. But that's really where we need to get back to with renewable energy. We need to have it local. We need to have it owned locally so that the revenue stays here, and we need to have it part of a circular economy so it's not extractive. I also co-founded the Climate Reality Project Hawaii chapter with several other people from Maui mostly. And that was a statewide chapter of the Climate Reality Project, which has now been divided into county projects. So we have the Maui County Climate Reality Project, and Beth Hurd, who you'll hear from her a little bit later. I'm counting on Beth to join it with us, because these organizations coming together is how we're going to address the issues and take the positions and actions that we need to take on Maui. I wanted to share this next slide because, let's see, let's get this to go. Okay, this was actually just printed in the LA Times on September 14th. And it hit home with me because I know it's up to all of us, but it was interesting to hear the Dalai Lama say, especially politicians, because, you know, that's what people call me. I don't really think of myself as a politician, but it is important to know that there are things that we need to do policy-wise and funding-wise to help out the folks that are actually working on the projects and the policies that are going to get us to where we need to go. And I also wanted to say, I know it's daunting to think about, you know, what could I do by planting one tree or even a grove of trees, but it's the same message about voting, because you only get one vote, but if everybody doesn't do it, we're going to be in a world of hurt. So I liken it to, you know, taking that one step as individuals and then coming together as groups. The changes that we've experienced just on Maui have been unprecedented. And everybody who lives here has been watching these things happen, the wildfires, the record-breaking high temperatures, the summers are hotter, the winters are getting colder, the sea level rise, king tides, and the shoreline erosion. So we're dealing with a lot of, right now, commercial buildings, but it's going to start hitting private houses and structures as well. The coral bleaching is becoming obvious. The years of over-tourism and water pollution that are affecting the health of our reef system. And I'm going to talk just briefly about that big lawsuit that we've all been following a little bit later. And food insecurity. 80% of our food is imported, and that number fluctuates depending on who you talk to, which politicians you talk to, between 80 and 90%. Although I do want to say, as a member of the Maui Nui Food Alliance, we're starting to look at developing a baseline at some point for where we really are at, because there's a lot of our food that many of us consume kind of off the grid, if you will, that's not quantified. The something like 70 to 100,000 head of axis deer on the island, the goats and chickens and pigs that are running around, the feral animals. And so there's a lot of that. There's also a lot of backyard gardens happening, and we funded some of those projects through the Maui County budget. So I'll touch on that a little bit later too. I wanted to kind of reach back and look at some of the things that Maui has led the state in, because our county is being known as being at the forefront of a lot of these actions and actually getting things done that are largely talked about on the other islands. The plastic bag ban was passed and went into effect January 11th, 2011. And then on my first term, we passed the polystyrene ban. So that went into effect December 31st, 2018. This current term, we passed the single-use plastic ban, which became effective January 1st, will become effective January 1st, 2022. So those are all things that we've actually shared with the other counties as well, and they're starting to follow suit. The polystyrene ban was actually, a version of it was passed on the Big Island, subsequent to Maui passing it. Okay, then we've done some things in this current budget that I'm really proud of that are starting to move the envelope forward for the small farmers and backyard gardeners and people who are really doing the work of regenerative agriculture. There is $2.5 million put into micro grants, and we also put additional money into farmer training and apprenticeship. We're looking at shoreline managed retreat, and we did fund a managed retreat plan for Molokai to see if we can get the entire island under one plan. And so that's starting to happen. That'll probably happen in the coming year, even though it was funded in the previous year's budget. We have dune management grants and coastal erosion studies. The latest coastal erosion study that was funded was for Ma'alaya. And we've been doing we put a lot of funding in for to start environmental protections like wetland restoration. The council was able to put the watershed maintenance and expansion into the budget. The budget came to us with a proposal to cut watershed operations by 20% across the board. So we put all that back in. The open space fund that was created back in 2002, we're looking at buying some large tracts of land, and specifically the Ma'alai and Mauka spot that is across from the Ocean Center. So that one is in negotiations right now, thanks to some funding that went into the budget. And we've been reallocating money into diversified agriculture from tourism. We had an extremely huge pot of money for tourism that was funded to our local Maui Visitors Bureau at like 10 times higher than any of the other counties. So we put that debt back down to a more realistic amount, from 4 million down to 1.5. And we put the extra money into some of these other industries that we see, and specifically agriculture. I've been an advocate for agriculture, more agriculture funding since I got on the council 4 years ago. And it took the pandemic, I guess, to really hit home how important that was. And we created the Council Climate Action and Resilience Committee, which started in January of this year. And I'm sorry about the background noise. Somebody walking through the house. I'm going to go into what we're doing in that committee next. So our committee is focused on these issues. And because it's the first council committee in the state for climate action and resilience, we're really kind of leading the way there on what this committee is looking at doing. But the list of things: carbon emissions, sea level rise, shoreline erosion, managed retreat. We're also charged with emergency preparedness and response. And this is specifically due to climate disasters. So we're tracking and looking at additional funding for the resilience hubs that are happening in the various communities. We're tracking the issues that have to do with deforestation, drought, the wetlands, of course, pollution, and then regenerative agriculture. So in the last 2 years, what we've done is pass these resolutions that have kind of laid the groundwork for the work that this committee the actions that this committee is going to take. And through these resolutions, we're in support of a just transition and emergency mobilization effort for restoring the safe climate. So we're paying attention to make sure that nobody's left behind, that everybody benefits from the actions. We've joined the County Climate Coalition and affirmed the county's commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement at the time when the US was trying to pull out of that agreement. We're supporting and urging the mayor to support the feminist economic recovery for COVID-19, which means that we pay attention to the ones who are hit hardest with the dwindling social services, and that's the women and minorities. We're supporting the Aloha Economic Futures Initiative and the transition to a circular economy. And I like what was said earlier about the idea of extraction of living materials going up, and this is where we need to start reversing that trend and be more circular and recycling, regenerative rather than extractive. And we just recently recognized October 30th, 2020 as Maui County Tree Planting Day. So I'm really excited about that. There are times, believe me, when I'd rather be planting a tree than working on the county council. It's not easy sometimes, but we are moving the envelope. And in our first year, these are the issues that we've been tackling. And I'm really glad to hear that Dr. Fletcher agrees with me that sea level rise is somewhere closer to the 6 foot level than the 3 foot level that we've been talking about. Because I've been saying that from the people I've been talking to, consultants to the Pentagon and people in DC, they've been talking about 6 feet, I think, since the 1980s. Some of the other stuff I've gone over but I wanted to mention that because this is a way where you can get involved as a citizen, is I created a volunteer citizens climate advisory committee, which is now called the Climate Action Advisory Committee. And we're starting to put some teeth and more structure to that. It started out kind of as a loose group of volunteer citizens, who really wanted to see some action. And so we're putting some structure to that so that they can actually start proposing policies and specific fundings. And now that we've laid the groundwork, that we can actually get some hard actions to happen. And we just today had a conversation with this committee about bringing the Climate Reality Project Maui chapter into this effort as a partner. So moving forward with actions that we have seen other municipalities make. I had a meeting in my committee, in the Climate Action and Resilience Committee, where we had 5 different states come and report on actions that they're taking. So there's a lot of precedents out there, and we don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel every time we take an action. So I think we're poised to support, through the county at least, support these actions in the coming year. We've been looking at green bonds and carbon tax credits. We passed 2 resolutions supporting tax credits at the federal and the state level. And I don't know, those 2 pieces of legislation haven't advanced as far as I know. But we just passed an ordinance in my committee to require an environmentalist and or climate change specialist on all of our planning commissions for Maui, Molokai. Well, I'm sorry to say Lanai is wanted to accept out of that. So it's actually for our Maui and Molokai Planning Commission and all of our community advisory committees. And this is something that's going to help. This move is so necessary. And we made the point that it's just at least one. It doesn't mean we can't have more than one environmentalist, because our planning commissions and advisory committees having to do with development have been heavily stacked with developers and realtors, and we haven't had a big voice by the environmental community on those bodies. As I promised, I wanted to touch on some of the litigation that's been happening in the environmental arena in the county. And of course, probably everybody on this call has heard about the Lahaina injection well lawsuit, the settlement agreement, the one that last year in 2019, the county council voted 5-4 to support the settlement agreement. However, we did not get compliance by the mayor, and he took the case to the Supreme Court anyway. Well, the Supreme Court surprisingly upheld the Clean Water Act. And so it was really a win for the people of Maui, a loss for the mayor's position. And we're still hoping to move forward with solutions, because the mayor has still been trying to take this back to local court at the district level. But as a council, we have funded the projects that we need to fund to start doing more recycling and in both Kihei and Lahaina wastewater treatment facilities. And so I'm going to be looking real closely this next year, hopefully, if knock on wood, if I get reelected, at really making sure that we're making that effort and we've got money in there to start retiring injection wells. I'd like to see the first ones retired, possibly in Ma'alaya. And I was able to hook them up with a wastewater innovation company that is looking at modular wastewater facility treatment plant. I don't know if we talked about the petroleum industry lawsuit that was filed, but Oahu did it first. Maui came second. I helped shepherd that lawsuit. And ironically, I couldn't vote for it because of a potential conflict of interest, since we, as a biodiesel company, we are competitors with the petroleum industry. But this is a lawsuit that's very similar to the tobacco industry lawsuit, where the industry has known for decades how damaging petroleum is, and has sat on reports and hidden reports and the policies that should have happened, due to the fact that we had reports talking about how damaging it is to the environment and to our health. So this is going to be treated the same way that the tobacco lawsuit is being treated. However, each entity that files lawsuit within the state is trying to keep it in a state, localized environment, so that we can address our needs here and not be part of a federal class action lawsuit. The other 2 cases were before my time on the council, but the Stop Cane Burning lawsuit was the first case to be heard in the Hawaii Environmental Court in 2016. And then we passed the GMO moratorium in 2014, which did not get supported by our then mayor and was not upheld by the courts. Okay, I did want to give a little bit of credit to what is happening at the County of Maui administration. And right now we have, in 2016, or actually in 2012, the people of Maui voted to install a environmental protection and sustainability division in the administration under the Department of Environmental Management. That, even though it passed in 2012 as a charter amendment, it was not addressed until after 2016 when, the outgoing mayor decided that he would actually put somebody in that position. So that sat empty. We have to be a bigger voice as a people, and we have to let our government know when we vote on something, we want it to happen. And that's just a prelude, because we've got 7 really good charter amendments on the ballot coming in November. And there's been concerted efforts on both sides for and against them. And then the Public Works has actually jumped in and reduced the amount of herbicides. They're small numbers right now, but they're experimenting. They're moving away from Roundup towards more sustainable practices like weed whacking, mowing. They're using steam truck and weed mats now experimentally. And they're working with the Beyond Pesticides group. They're also moving towards biological drainage systems. And this was a big push I made in South Maui, because the master drainage plan showed concrete drainage systems that would have just had the water flowing straight down into the ocean. So doing biological drainage systems, which is what we're exploring now, and we're towards the end of the eco solutions recommendations, I think should be coming out fairly soon, but this will be plant-based and absorb a lot of the water as it comes down towards the ocean. The Department of Parks and Recreation has proceeded with their pesticide-free park pilot project, so that's been happening. And the Planning Department is also pivoting towards complete streets and walkable communities. So they're all starting to work towards this walkable, livable, less vehicles on the road end goal. And then in fiscal 2020, the previous budget, all the newly purchased county vehicles were hybrid wherever possible. They upgraded the hazard disaster mitigation plan, and we're working closely with the Maui Emergency Management Agency on that. And then in fiscal 21, our budget included the Mayor's Office, Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resilience Office. And this was something I think it was probably driven by the council creating our county council committee first. And that, I think, really drove the mayor to create that office. So we're trying to work closely with them. If you know Makalea Ane, you know that she's very dedicated. She's the head of this office now. Extremely dedicated gal. She was our environmental coordinator before she took over as this office. And we're looking forward to working closely with them on the climate action plan that they're developing. The public-private partnerships I wanted to touch on, the Hawaiian Electric proposed Pulehu and Kahana solar projects are enabling the retirement of 38 megawatts of oil-fired Kahului plant. The plant in 2024 is when they're supposed to come online. Not sure what's happening with Pulehu right now, because I just heard that might be retiring, and it pulled off the table because there's in the private sector, they're also feeling the pinch in the renewable energy sector, especially solar, because the use of electricity has gone down so drastically that they're starting to look at their numbers to see if they can pull off these large solar projects. And that's related to, that no tourists here, the hotels aren't operating, and a lot of the restaurants have gone out of business.
Hey, Kelly, sorry to interrupt, but are you about to wrap up? Because you're...
Yeah, I'm almost done.
Okay.
So I just wanted to touch on these 2 water treatment projects, the Reef Power project, which is it's a pilot project that's been privately funded, using Limu for wastewater treatment. And then there's this Regenitech project that the county has funded for a feasibility study, which would be a local biochar facility that would also help with inputs on our crops. And then looking ahead, this is my last slide. We're proposing to add climate action as a major objective in the countywide policy plan, which right now it was not one of the top goals, and there are 10 goals, so this would be the 11th goal. We're trying to step up the goals for Maui County, and I'm looking at earlier than the state goals of 2045 for renewable energy, 100% renewable energy utility scale, and water use and recycling. The state actually has a goal of 2045, all all water use at the government levels, at the state level and the county level will be reused and recycled, and none of it will be wasted. And you know, that's something that a lot of people don't know is in the HRS, the Hawaii Rice Statutes. We're looking at things like net zero energy buildings, which some other municipalities have already done. Anything over 5,000 feet that's new has to be built as a net zero. Ordinances on banning pesticides are being proposed. Focus on locally produced and owned renewable energy. That's kind of my thing. It's looking at community based, since we talk about how much of our energy dollars are leaving the state. And when we have an EV system that's owned by somebody in Japan, those are still our energy dollars leaving the state. So I want to focus on locally produced, locally owned renewable energy. Wastewater treatment applications. I've been doing a lot of research on that and hope to bring some funding for some new projects in the next year. And then of course, diversifying the economy. And this I see as a huge opportunity. We're looking at the Thrive Agenda, which is a new federal initiative. Our own Kaniela Ng, who is a former state representative for South Maui, is now the climate campaign director for People's Action. And so I'm working with him on supporting this Thrive Agenda, which is sort of a repackaging of the Green New Deal, but it addresses many of the issues we're facing with COVID, and it's getting a lot more support and some bipartisan support, which the Green New Deal did not have. So that's the end of my presentation, looking ahead. And I also wanted to thank Dr. Fletcher for discussing the issue of a nonpartisan congressional think tank, because that's really where we need to get to. We need to make this a nonpartisan issue. And I'm also really thrilled to see youth here, because this is probably a bigger issue for our youth than it is even for people of my age. And I'll end there, and thank you for your time and attention. Thank you so much, Rob, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And I think this, without politicians who understand the climate crisis and are willing to take action, I think we're hosed. We absolutely need this. So it's great to hear what has been done and what is in the works in terms of climate action on Maui. And for those who just tuned in, I wanted to remind you that this is Climate Crisis Forum organized by the Ha'olu Paimoku, Retreat Hawaii, and culminating in a statewide tree planting day, October 30th. You can go to retreathawaii.org/planting to see all the sites and sign up for yourself or a group of people. And I also want to make a plug for our sponsor, a little fashion moment here. And Andy, would you take it away?
Oh, now I'm too dark. Well, I wanted to show off our t-shirt. Here's the logo. This is the front, obviously, unless my head's on backwards. And then there's a nice picture on the back. I can't tell if that's in the field or not.
There's a beautiful picture on the back, and it says, when is the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. When is the next best time? Today. And these t-shirts are available in a number of colors and number of sizes on the website, retreathawaii.org, retreat-hawaii.org. So you can go there and check those out as well. Thank you, Andrew.
Sure.
Okay, so now we're moving into a little bit of the conservation side of this forum. Our next speaker, Chris Warren, has been with Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project since 2012, where he serves as the restoration lead, statistician, and field crew leader. He holds a master's in population and conservation biology from Texas State University and has worked with several threatened and endangered forest birds throughout the US. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. See if it... All right. So I'm going to be talking about forest restoration and its benefits for native birds. And I wanted to start with, there's a little bit of a lag, the question of what is the value of a forest? I mean, I think certainly from the perspective of climate change, as we've been discussing, the benefits of carbon sequestration and other benefits, but many times we try to sell the idea of habitat preservation or restoration from the perspective of the water resources that we gain for people. And this is all very valid points, but I also want to remind people that these forests are home for many, many animals and plants that in many cases here in Hawaii specifically are endemic. And as many people probably know, before humans arrived in Hawaii, the islands were primarily forested islands with a staggering array of habitat types, from low forests all the way up to the wet ohia-dominated forests. And then sadly, through human activity, we have lost the grand majority of the forest, and that impact has not been equal across all forest types. We are still, well, fortunately, we're still left with a large portion of the native wet forest, but we have lost the vast majority of native dry and mesic forests, predominantly on the leeward slopes. Many times when we talk about the native songbirds here in Hawaii, we call them the forest birds. I mean, I belong to Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project, and that's a really good name for them. I mean, they are animals of the forest. They need the trees. And they're also the largest group of forest birds in Hawaii are the Hawaiian honeycreepers, and they're a great example of adaptive radiation from a single species of finch that arrived here several million years ago. We got over 50 species of Hawaiian honeycreeper. Sadly, though, they're an example of why we have deserved the moniker of the extinction capital of the world. From those more than 50 species, we're left with only 17 that still exist with any certainty. And of those, 4 to 5 we may lose in the next decade. And the reason for those extinctions and continuing declines are from a number of factors, from invasive mammalian predators to habitat loss and change and alteration, as well as introduced disease. So we went from exclusively native forest at some point, from Mauka to Makai, to loss and alteration of the habitat through human activities. And now when we do have forests, mostly the trees that exist at the lowest elevation are predominantly non-native. The middle elevations can be a mix of native and non. And fortunately, most of the upper elevation, the highest elevation forests, are still dominated by native forest. And the Hawaiian honeycreepers are really heavily impacted by avian malaria, which is a mosquito-borne disease that was introduced shortly after the mosquito was introduced in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And as many people probably know, mosquitoes love warm and wet habitats. So places like lower elevations that provide that warm, wet climate, they can live year-round and they can transmit the disease year-round. And when I describe how mosquitoes exist and move around on the mountain, I like to use the example of waves, like on a beach and the tide lines. So at areas where mosquitoes exist at higher densities and can transmit disease year-round, that's like below the tide line, so underwater. And then at middle elevations, there are areas when mosquitoes can't the king tides. And the frequency of when these things happen We're still just getting to an understanding of that. It might happen every other year. It may happen multiple times a year. And the distribution of the native birds on the mountain is largely determined by these two factors: their tolerance for non-native vegetation and their tolerance for disease. So species like Hawaii amakihi and apapane both have a tolerance for some non-native trees, and they're both developing resistance to avian malaria. So they can exist at relatively low elevations compared to other species. Now, some species like Iwi and Maui Alawahio, they have a tolerance for non-native trees, but less of a tolerance for malaria. And then other species, particularly the most specialized and not surprisingly the most critically endangered species like Akohekohe and Kiwikiu, they show no tolerance for non-native forests. They're found exclusively in native habitats, and they seem to show no resistance or tolerance for avian malaria. And so we find them at the very top of the mountain. And as has been discussed, like Tim was talking about the warming trend here in Hawaii, but also the change in rainfall patterns are predicted to shift the mosquito range up in the mountain. And that will further restrict the ranges of many of these birds and kind of squish them toward the top of the mountain, because we're not gaining forest. There's really nowhere left for them to run. So what can we do about this? When we see light at the end of the tunnel? Well, in the conservation community, we're largely tackling this from the perspective of disease control and habitat restoration. Oh, that was a very slow animation. And when we talk about forest restoration, I think it's important to define the term, because it's kind of a slippery term. Are we trying to restore the forest to some previous time period, like before humans arrived in Hawaii, or are we trying to restore it to a functional habitat, whatever that means? I think for a lot of the forest birds, many times we think of functional habitat as, can a specific species persist in an area? Do the resources exist for that particular species? And then where do we put our resources in terms of forest restoration? Most of the conservation restoration has occurred at some of the highest elevations. Some of that specifically to benefit the forest birds, which, as I discussed, exist mostly at higher elevations. But then also in some of the middle elevations, many of these areas still contain pockets of native forest that can be restored to its former glory. Other areas are just completely denuded pasture land that really falls under reforestation. And then even though the coastal habitats should and are being restored in many places, for the native forest birds, because of avian malaria, that's a very long timeline. And so I'm not really going to be talking about that today. And then as the destruction or the damage to the forest has not been equal in all different forest habitats, the need for restoration or reforestation varies by type, by forest type. And the need is greatest in the leeward, mesic, and dry forests. And so here's another cartoon of Hawaiian Islands, specifically Maui, with the windward wet forest on the right and the leeward mesic forest on the left. So on the leeward forests, we have considerably less habitat and, not surprisingly, fewer species that persist in these areas. And the dream, of course, is to restore enough forest on the leeward side above the elevation at which mosquitoes are having a devastating impact. And eventually we can have more species either be restored to those areas through translocation or make their way on their own. And my organization, Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project, has been restoring portions of Nakula Natural Area Reserve, which is in the Kahikinui region of leeward Haleakala. And together with our organization, multiple state and federal organizations have planted over 250,000 native trees and shrubs in the last few years. And it's been a very gratifying experience, and we can see huge changes in a pretty short period of time, but it's not without significant effort. The first step is to fence and remove feral ungulates. We look at that center photo, I'll let you guess which side still has cows and goats and which side they've been removed from. So this is a boundary fence of Nakula, and the trees, if you can see my cursor, on the right side, those are naturally regenerating koa that have just come up on their own since just removal of those feral ungulates. But many species, many tree and shrub species are going to require significant continued outplanting in the future, and that is continuing now. But it requires, in many cases, local seed collection. Here on the left, we see Zach collecting some pilo fruit for future outplanting. This is actually, he's collecting it from a former outplanted pilo, about 5 or 6 years old. And we can see really big changes in the habitat in a pretty short period of time. And that it's been very exciting to see, and there's been more and more restoration that is being planned. More fences are going up, a lot more trees are going in the ground, and that's very exciting. But I also want to bring up the point that just because you may live at a slightly lower elevation does not mean that you cannot restore whatever property you have, your backyard. These can be habitats, including for native birds. Specifically, if you live above 1,000 feet, Hawaii amakihi specifically are developing resistance to avian malaria, and we're seeing them shift downhill. I probably don't have much time to talk about it today, but we're planning lots of controls of mosquitoes on the landscape, which will hopefully help control avian malaria. And as that happens, we expect the birds to expand their range downhill. And they're going to need trees downhill in order for them to expand into, which may be your backyard. And in these photos here, I'm highlighting a couple really great folks and organizations. On the left, that's Ethan and Jonathan, Native Nursery. In the middle is Anna Palomino, Ho'olava Farms on the Olinda Rare Plant Facility. Of course, Maui Nui Botanical Gardens. And all these organizations and others are producing just tens of thousands of native trees and shrubs for conservation restoration, as well as your backyard landscaping. And this really can have an impact for the native forest birds, particularly in the future. Given how long it takes for trees to grow, like the t-shirt says, the best time to plant is 20 years ago, but second best time is right now. And hopefully we can have a big impact for everybody, including the native forest birds. And with that, I just want to say thank you. And then I can talk more or respond to questions about the mosquito controls that are coming down the pike. But given the focus of this, I just wanted to talk about the restoration for right now. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And that kind of highlights that trees are important for many reasons, and all these efforts contribute in one way or another to both halting climate change and also to allowing the species used to flourish on the Hawaiian Islands to come back again. We're going to continue with the conservation area, but this time moving to Kauai. And our next speaker is Tess Rawson. Tess is a project coordinator with the Makawahi Cave Reserve on Kauai. And she received her undergraduate degree in landscape architecture at the University of Guelph in Canada, and her graduate certification in ecosystem restoration from Niagara College. Welcome, Tess.
Hi. All right. So thank you for that introduction. So yeah, I'm project coordinator at Makawai Cave Reserve, located on the south end of Kauai and leeward side of Maha'ulepu, which is a coastal site. I work under Lyda Piggott-Burney and Dr. David Burney, who are paleoecologists from Fordham University and began studying the caves in 1992. So I'm just going to introduce the site a little bit, and then I'll get into how we're mitigating climate change. The Burneys came across the largest limestone cave system in the archipelago, dating 400,000-year-old rocks. They quickly discovered via core sampling and pit digging that the sediment within this cave was a pH neutral sediment, which preserves fossils that are both animal and plant derived. This site actually is the richest fossil locality in the Pacific Island region, showing data back to about 10,000 years ago. These fossils allow scientists to see the events that have been taking place on Maha'ulepu coast for the past 10,000 years. So we see extinction patterns, post-glacial climate change, sea level rise and fall, human introductions and the impacts that these human introductions have, as well as, and most importantly to my project, is previous ecosystems. So when the Burneys first started researching the cave, the landscape outside of the cave was abandoned farmland. The more they learned about the history through the fossils, the more they were inclined to restore it to what the cave data showed was previously there, which would be the coastal dry forest ecosystem, the coastal shrubland, and freshwater ecosystems. The Burneys began the restoration in 2002, and people were quite hesitant if it would work, partly because these ecosystems, two of them are some of the rarest ecosystems in all of Hawaii. Today, those 17 acres that they replanted 10,000 plants on are growing successfully. So I'll now get into how threats posed by climate change are affecting our site and how we predict they will affect our site. So minor sea level rise of 1 meter, only 1 meter, will threaten our wetland restorations with saltwater incursion, which would make the area less suitable for native plants and animals in the area. Rising temperature and uncertain weather patterns will threaten and challenge native plant restorations. For example, we had a 4-year drought and had to figure out how to combat that. There's also increased risk of severe storms and floods that can destroy habitat. So for example, a 2-meter increase will flood our freshwater cave system and pose as a direct threat to our endemic blind wolf spider residing in Maha'ulepu cave systems and nowhere else in the world. So we're taking a lot of action to mitigate climate change and protect our reserve, all based on science done at the caves and research. Our maturing forests that I was talking about, the dry forest ecosystems, are about 5 to 10 meters above sea level. And ways that we are trying to mitigate climate change in this area is, well, for one, we've introduced African sulcata tortoises, which seems a little strange, but they're actually meant to fill a niche of some of the extinct large flightless birds that were found in the fossil data. The tortoises are meant to be a low carbon alternative for weed control. So they are an alternative to weed eating and lawn mowing, and they actually are quite successful. I could get into talking about them for a while, but we are also expanding our plantings as much as possible to create more carbon sinks. And we are doing scientific-based intentional design. So for example, where we are anticipating flooding and sea level rise, we will have salt tolerant species. But But what I really want to talk about today is a grant that we've actually been awarded by the Climate Conservation Society as a climate adaptation fund. So the WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, provides grants to catalyze innovative science-driven projects responding to impacts of climate change. So the project will focus on 70 acres of rocky and eroding limestone quarry that's that was abandoned several years ago. This area is well above the 2-meter impact zone for sea level rise, so that's partly why we chose it. And we will be translocating 4,000 native plants from our nursery stock to this quarry, in which we have 6 acres of successful 3-year-old plantings already. With the goal, all of this with the goal of continuing our novel dry forest ecosystem and creating 3 new pond systems. So in terms of controlling carbon release with dry forests in this exposed limestone, the reason why we chose this area is because exposed limestone is actually a source of additional carbon dioxide released in the atmosphere. Calcium carbonate erodes in acid rain events, and the rock releases carbon dioxide as it breaks down. This process can be slowed by revegetating due to forest soil buildup, protecting the rock beneath. So therefore, our dry forest will protect against the release of carbon dioxide in addition to creating carbon sinks. Carbon sequestration in Hawaii in Hawaiian dry forest has not been studied in detail. However, when you compare Hawaiian native forests to invasive non-native plant communities, you will find that Hawaiian forests are multi-storied, form deep litter layers and carbon-rich topsoils, and creates microclimate that suppresses fires. Non-native have a single layer of woody vegetation, reduced litter layer, and little carbon in the leached thin soils that are fire prone. The second initiative that this grant is supporting is installing 3 large pond systems. So we will be putting in 20 acres of a total of 20 acres of these ponds that can help seal off the limestone substrate and vegetate the otherwise barren land with about 1,000 native plants. So in total, we'll be planting 5,000 plants. Marine sediment stores a lot of carbon that is fully sequestered in undisturbed environments. That is pretty much the project that we're doing. And on October 30th, that'll be our first planting date with Retree, which we already have full volunteers for. We've filled up our list and we're really excited for. Our project at MCR is an effort to aid the native biota of Kauai and adapt the climate to climate change. We aim to educate the public, and we have a tourist in the cave between 10 and 4 Thursday through Sunday, and we also have an extensive volunteer system currently. If you also want to learn more, you can go to our cavereserve.org, where we have several resources. So thank you so much for having me. Aloha.
Thank you, Tess. I will be sure to visit the cave and get one of those tours from you when I come to Kauai. So just a reminder, on Kauai, the Makawahi Cave site is full as far as volunteers. You can't sign up there. We do have sites on Oahu and Hawaii Island and Maui where you can sign up and plant on October 30th. Okay, now, having politicians working against climate change is really important. But on the other hand, just politicians are not going to pull it off either. We need people and we need activists. And our next speakers are going to be talking about youth activism and activism in general, and in particular in the age of social media, how that's changed activism and climate activism. We're going to be hearing from Dyson Chi, Kiana Liu, and Sophie Domingo. And they'll introduce themselves, but I just want to say that they're youth climate activists with the Hawaii Youth Climate Coalition and Maui Huliao. Welcome.
All right, aloha mai kako. Today the three of us are going to be talking about activism in the age of social media. My name is Sophia Domingo, and I recently graduated from Dartmouth College with a degree in environmental studies, and I've been working with the Maui Huliao Foundation to create virtual curriculum that focuses on climate literacy and aloha aina for our students on Maui.
Aloha everyone, my name is Dyson Chi. I live in Honolulu, Hawaii, and I'm with the Hawaii Youth Climate Coalition, which is a youth-led organization taking on the climate crisis through just and equitable means.
Aloha everyone, my name is Kiana Liu. I'm currently a sophomore at Loyola Marymount University studying film production and minoring in environmental studies, and I'm also an alumni of the Maui Huliao Foundation. So I guess explaining some of the topics we're going to cover is obviously the overarching thing of how activism is, intertwined with social media in the days of today. But the few subtopics we'll be talking about is the beauties and flaws of social media, because obviously there's that double flip side, sorry. And then social media and youth advocacy, and then social media within the Indigenous environmental movement. So the first topic is the beauties and the flaws of social media. So as we all know, social media has created a lot of positive change around the world. And it's been a tool for good use. We've seen, for example, the Australia fires and how people have come together to support and donate to these causes. So in that way, social media is a really good thing. But on the flip side, social media has also a lot of negatives, because it starts off as a tool, but then social media companies, kind of control what we see, and a lot of misinformation, takes place during the spread of fake news. So those are definitely things to consider when thinking of social media. So some of the concepts I want to, kind of go over, just because I'll probably be saying them and you'll be like, what is this term? So the first term is Gen Z. So I am part of Gen Z, and everyone else presenting, Dyson and Sophia, are part of Gen Z. So it's the newest generation to be named, and we were born between 1996 and 2015. So we're currently between the ages of 5 and 24 years old. Another term is engagement. So this means how many public shares, likes, and comments you get on a post or a story, or there's so many forms of social media nowadays. So any type of thing that requires you to be on your phone, that's considered engagement. It's also measured by how much time you spend on each piece of content. And that's the crazy thing about social media, is that they really do record all of that. Another term is burnout. So it's a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. And I think that a lot of us can agree that social media can be exhausting. Seeing a lot of things on our feed about all these different issues happening around the world, including climate change, I think, we get burnt out a lot. And it's important to recognize that we do get burnt out and take that time to just step back and go to the beach and just relax, because it can be very overwhelming. And then, like I said earlier, fake news is false news stories created by or widely shared to distributed for the purpose of basically misinforming the masses. And because social media is so instant and you're getting information in like 15 seconds or less, sometimes it's really easy for fake news to spread widely. So kind of the thing that inspired this whole topic was this Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma. So I'm gonna do show the trailer. Of course, you can see it on YouTube. I'm just gonna show it in this small screen just because I don't wanna go to YouTube. But I would encourage you to do a mini activity. Try searching up in your Google search bar, climate change is, and see what shows up. So I'm just gonna show this for 2 minutes.
When you go to Google and type in climate change is, you're going to see different results depending on where you live and the particular things that Google knows about your interests.
That's not by accident, that's a design technique.
What I want people to know is that everything they're doing online is being watched, is being tracked. Every single action you take is carefully monitored and recorded.
A lot of people think Google's just a search box and Facebook's just a place to see what my friends are doing. What they don't realize is there's entire teams of engineers whose job is to use your psychology against you.
I was the co-inventor of the Facebook like button.
I was the president of Pinterest,
Google, Twitter, Instagram.
There were meaningful changes happening around the world because of these platforms. I think we were naive about the flip side of that coin.
We get rewarded by hearts, likes, thumbs up, and we conflate that with value and we conflate it with truth.
A whole generation is more anxious, more depressed.
I always felt like fundamentally it was a force for good. I don't know if I feel that way anymore.
Facebook discovered that they were able to affect real-world behavior and emotions without ever triggering the user's awareness. They are completely clueless.
Fake news spreads 6 times faster than true news. We're being bombarded with rumors.
If everyone's entitled to their own facts, there's really no need for people to come together. In fact, there's really no need for people to interact.
We have less control over who we are and what we really believe.
If you want to control the population of your country, there has never been a tool as effective as Facebook.
We built these things and we have a responsibility to change it. The intention could be, how do we make the world better?
If technology creates mass chaos, loneliness, more polarization, more election hacking, more inability to focus on the real issues, we're toast.
This is checkmate on humanity.
Awesome. Well, I hope that didn't scare you too much about the state of our future, but definitely try to do that mini activity, because when I tried, the first thing that it suggested was a climate change is real t-shirt. So you can already see how it's like monetizing just your simple searches and things like that. So the king of fake news is, of course, Donald Trump. And as we saw by the debates yesterday, it was a real train wreck. So things like this, with someone with huge influence, such as Trump, and he has such influence on the government, we need to hold these people accountable for the things that they say, even if it's on social media, and hold them accountable for the fake news that they're spreading and the fake opinions that they contribute. So, you know, this is an example, like the whole climate crisis is not only fake news, it's fake science. There's no climate crisis. There's weather and climate all around the world. And in fact, carbon dioxide is the main building block of all life. We all know that, but excess carbon dioxide made from humans is obviously not good for our atmosphere. So kind of a term I made up to kind of wrap around what we're facing right now as youth activists is show and tell activism. So it's when someone simply reposts something without reading or fact checking the source first. And, you know, in spotting fake news, obviously consider the source if it's credible, fact check it, because some people can just make an infographic, post it, and then, you know, that spreads all over and misinforms a bunch of people. So making sure that it's an actual credible source is super important. And also, instead of taking action in these ways by just resharing things and not thinking about the actual issue itself, maybe take action by signing petitions, attending a protest, if you're able to, of course, or donating to these causes. And spreading information is important, but make sure you are intentional with what you share.
Awesome. Thanks, Kiana. So segueing that, Kiana was just talking about, right, the pros and cons of social media. And what I'm about to talk about is one of the pros that I've personally seen, and that's social media in youth advocacy. So for me personally, social media, it's been a very useful tool for organizing the community with an emphasis on youth in the community around key issues and keeping them updated on these issues that aren't always easy to access. Sometimes you have to go through very bulky or very difficult websites to access them, such as legislation. And so the case study that I'd like to provide is something called Bill 40, which we passed here on Oahu in the city and county of Honolulu back in 2019. So Bill 40, as you can see here, was a piece of legislation relating to disposable plastics. It would phase them out and basically takes effect in 2021, and the second stage takes effect in 2022. And Bill 40, it started off with just a few people who came out to testify, no more than several dozen adults, and at most, maybe 3 or 4 youth coming out to these hearings, which in itself is actually rather high for engagement on some level, but very low in this purpose. However, by the last hearing, the amount of people coming out to testify on Bill 40 was easily hitting hundreds. And in terms of written and virtual testimony, we're hitting 1,000, easily 2,000. And also if you add, as you can see in this picture, there's a piece of paper that we're all holding up. That's a signature scroll that contains signatures from 1,500 youth in support of the bill. Put those together, we're hitting 3,500 pieces of testimony on one piece of legislation, which is remarkable. Most pieces of legislation, which Councilmember King could probably attest to, you don't even get nearly that much testimony. Usually it's just a handful. And so this was really remarkable. And part of what allowed so many people to come out was the use of social media. I personally use social media and mostly Instagram to reach out to other youth to notify them of the hearings. And we use social media to share about the hearings because these hearing notices would only come out at most 6 days in advance of the hearings. And so we had to really hustle to get the word out on these hearings. So a mini activity that I'd like you to try out is to go to either Facebook or Instagram, and in the search engine, try type hashtag Bill 40 and see what pops up. Not all the results are going to be about the Bill 40 that I'm talking about, the one relating to single-use plastics, but the majority of them will be. And not only that, it'll also be interesting to see, what pops up on your feed. And so I want you to find a post that shares about Bill 40, the single-use plastics bill, disposable plastics bill. And whether that's, a thank you post or a call to action, just find that post. Now, once you've done that, go to the City and County of Honolulu website, or the Honolulu City Council website. As you can see in the search engine there, it's www.honolulu.gov/council, or you can just type in Honolulu City Council into your search engine. Now go over here and try find Bill 40. If you can find it and you've never used this website before, I will be very, very impressed. And I don't suggest that you look it up right now, because by the time our presentations have ended, you'll probably still be looking for it. So do suggest that you look it up afterwards when you have free time and once this presentation is over. And this is part of the reason why we use social media to spread the word, because as great as some of these websites are, they're not as convenient. But like Kiana was saying, that convenience is a double-edged sword. And so the ability to spread information rapidly does have its pros and cons. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Sophia.
Thank you, Dyson. As Dyson discussed, social media has blossomed into a very efficient tool for social change. And I wanted to highlight how social media has helped to uplift underrepresented non-Indigenous voices. So due to social media, there has been an exponential increase in the amount of information that we consume each day, especially for younger generations who are most active on social media. Much more of today's youth is actively aware about Indigenous issues because of social media, and since they are more informed, they're better able to support these communities as allies. I really like this term media ecology because we typically use the word ecology to describe the interactions and relationships between living things in their environment. But then with media ecology, we describe how we interact and communicate with media and technology and how we distribute information online. So many Indigenous communities have relied on oral histories, sharing stories and traditions from generation to generation, but now social media is helping to amplify these voices and expand the influence of Indigenous knowledge to people from all over the world across so many different media platforms. It has completely changed the way that we protest. As you can see, there's some pictures from the Dakota Access Pipeline protest, and then this picture on the right is actually Dartmouth's Hokupa'a Hawaiian Club. We did a protest on Indigenous Peoples Day, but social media has been able to allow protests to reach a much larger audience than just the physical people that you come in contact with. And so that's been a really awesome benefit. Indigenous Climate Action is an organization that believes that Indigenous people's rights and knowledge systems are critical to developing solutions to the climate crisis and achieving climate justice. And this is really important for us to focus on because the environmental movement and Indigenous issues are so interconnected. And up until this point, the environmental movement has been largely led by people of both racial privilege and class privilege. So we need to shift to decolonize the movement and recenter the conversation around Native perspectives and peoples. It's really important to acknowledge this intersectionality of environmental issues because it disproportionately affects Indigenous and other minority groups and their ways of life. When we start to analyze how Western society places value on land and knowledge, we see that Indigenous values focus on living in harmony with the land and respecting the land as one's ancestor, whereas Western society, land is privatized and commodified, natural resources are controlled by corporations, and we don't value Native intelligence on the same level as scientific knowledge and academia. Traditional ecological knowledge is a commonly used term used to describe the constantly evolving place-based knowledge acquired by Indigenous and local peoples over hundreds or thousands of years through direct contact with the environment. Creating relationships with the land through cultural beliefs and practices that are developed over years and years of experience helped create this traditional ecological knowledge, but it also has an element of adaptive capacity, which refers to the resilience of this knowledge system and the harmony that Indigenous people have with the land, because the environment is constantly evolving, but Indigenous peoples have studied and lived with the land, so they're able to adapt and evolve with it. So by shifting our perspective on environmental issues, we can ensure that Indigenous voices are heard and respected. So we've seen this with the Mauna Kea Kukia'i Mauna protests against the 30-meter telescopes, because social media has helped to rally worldwide support and involve celebrities and influencers to raise awareness and gain national sympathy. Celebrities such as Jason Momoa, Dwayne Johnson, and Kelly Slater, and many, many others have really helped to increase this influence and awareness, as well as hashtags such as Aloha Aina, We Are Mauna Kea, Kukia'i Mauna, and then campaigns such as Jam for Mauna Kea Worldwide by Mana Maoli. They all have helped to just create a lot of talk about the issue, and the Mauna Kea protests have been happening for many years. TMT started around like 2015, but it's only been within like recent years that it's made global news, and this was largely because of social media. Social media also allows leaders of the movement to express their beliefs and control the narrative, organizing, raising funds, and promoting petitions. So Pu'uhonua o Pu'uhuluhulu was established by the Kia'i, or protectors, to protect Mauna Kea and serve as an information hub. They had organized resources, live classes, and workshops to educate and uplift the community and support the movement. They've even had workshops about social media and how to use social media to your advantage and how to promote the movement. So overall, I thought that this final Pu'uhonua o Pu'uhuluhulu page, you can see that the Facebook page has about 30,000 people and the Instagram has about 40,000 followers. So it really has a large influence, and it's had so much really beneficial educational resources on it. And so it's my hope that future movements can really learn from Indigenous perspectives and use social media to the benefit.
Yeah, I guess we just want to say mahalo for listening. And here's our contact information if you'd like to reach out to us, mauihuliafoundation.org for me and Sophia. And then Dyson, do you want to?
Yep, just contact me. My personal email is chidyson@gmail.com. And please do check out Hawaii's Climate Coalition at climatestrikehawaii.org.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much again for listening.
Thank you guys, and certainly learning how to understand and make use of social media in a way which is constructive and helps us combat climate change instead of denying it would be something we all need to learn. I want to just share briefly the what it looks like if you go to the retreehawaii.org/planting site, and how you can easily choose a site to go plant at, or if you have a site where you want to plant, or if you want to plant at home and then send in your pictures and have them counted, you can do that there too. We have a number of questions have come in from the audience, and I'd like all our speakers to turn on your video so you're visible. And I will direct the first question to Chip Fletcher. And the question here is about Hawaii, you said, is special in many ways. It doesn't contribute as much to climate change as many other places. However, it is also special in the sense that to get here, you pretty much have to take a plane, and planes are notorious for spewing greenhouse gases. So what do you say about that, about the role of transportation to and from Hawaii?
I'll be right there. Yes, so if I recall correctly, aviation worldwide is responsible for about 2.5% of emissions. And then I was just looking up online, maritime transport, another 2.5%. So that's 5% globally from both those types of transportation. So I understand that next year we may see the first airplane go inter-island based on battery power. I asked the person, it's Elemental Accelerator, who was funding some of this, and I asked them, well, when will we see the first airplane flying to the continent? And the answer was, don't hold your breath. It's going to be a long, long time before battery power can can go that far. And with regard to marine transportation, the marine transportation community has pledged a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. And there are lots of technologies like sail and others to assist marine transportation and to get rid of the need to constantly burn fossil fuels. And I have to confess, I missed about half of your speaking the question. So am I at all hitting the mark here with this answer?
Yes, you are. And actually, at the let's see, it was at the Maui Energy Conference a few years ago. They said that besides, it'll be a long ways, I guess, before airplanes are driven by batteries and solar power. However, they can switch their fuel consumption to more biofuel, and that will reduce the amount of emissions.
Yeah, actually, I'm working with a guy who wants to put a direct air capture plant at Barbers Point. DAC pulls CO2 out of the air, and then if you can break the CO2 into CO and combine it with hydrogen, you can actually make jet fuel. And this synthetic fuel, you would then burn in the form of a jet, and then pull it back out of the air. So you're not reducing the CO2 content in the atmosphere, but you're not adding to it either. And should the DAC plant be able to spin up a little bit and pull more than is needed for aviation out of the air, that additional CO2 could be sequestered. The rocks of the Hawaiian Islands will chemically react with carbon dioxide and create a mineral. And all we have to do is drill a hole and inject CO2 down there, and you can line the pore spaces of the hole with this sequestered carbon dioxide. They're already doing this in Iceland because they're made of the same rocks, basalt, volcanic rock.
Iceland and Hawaii are almost like cousins, so that we can learn from them and they can learn from us. Another question.
Rob, can I add a little bit to that real quick?
Sure, definitely.
Air transportation in particular. I mean, another way that has been worked on, and actually last I heard there was going to be a pilot or prototype between Los Angeles and Honolulu. And that was a hybridization of the old dirigibles, the blimps. It was taking a version of that, scaling it and streamlining it somewhat so it was more like an airplane. And then running it, it would take about close to 2 days to go from Los Angeles to Honolulu. It would take off and land on water. It could hold immense amounts of cargo, and it would use less than 25% of air travel and quite a bit less than even sea travel. One of the problems with air travel of that nature is that pilots are limited to only a certain number of hours at any one time, and they have to land and switch out because they can't stay in the cockpit that long. But with this particular vehicle, there are sleeping quarters so that pilots could do that, and also it can run, autonomously. So there are various ways. The concept of putting a battery in an airplane is very unlikely, just too much weight. Fuel cells, if anybody can crack it, everybody keeps talking about it. We used to work for a fuel cell company. The problem is always still the platinum requirement for the catalyst. If that nut can be cracked, you're going to see our world change tremendously in a very, very short period of time. So there are things that could go on. Air travel's a trick. Boeing, I worked in a spot where they were working on trying to create, Kelly's worked with Pacific Biodiesel jet fuel as one of those things. That's certainly in play, but then also the question of a hybrid so that you could take off with jet fuel to get the thrust necessary, but then cruise with electric power, which would be a lot more easy to do. So there's things going on, and they certainly could happen anytime if we had to. We need the emphasis. This is the problem. We've got an oil cartel that is preventing us from being innovative. That's the whole problem. And until we can strike back and require that and help them understand that it's not going to be profitable to continue on the pace that they are, then we're not going to see as much innovation. They will just fight it and usually kill it.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that have to do with electric bikes and reducing the use of fossil fuel powered ground transportation. And one of them I'll address to Kelly King. That's can the county council make the roads more friendly to bikers, which we could address both carbon reduction as well as health issues, mental and physical health?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do is create more walkable, bikeable communities. I think we need a lot more pressure from the public. Not sure the electric bike proposition, because regular bikes use no use no power, other than your body power. I think that's probably the best thing is, actually pedaling a bike. But I wanted to comment too on our youth presentation, because I have to say you folks gave me so much hope listening to those presentations, and the grasp of social media, the importance of it, but also the cautionary. That's one of the problems that we have, with these kinds of issues, Rob, like, putting more money into bikeways and even multimodal mass transit and those kinds of things is trying to get to the point where social media is more productive than it is destructive, because then, you start one conversation and then someone else comes along and attacks it. And pretty soon you're down this rabbit hole of just this back and forth language. And so it made me close to tears to hear you folks talk about, understanding that and trying to figure out a way to rise above it or to use it in a positive way. And that just was music to my ears. So I think that we are going to be putting more money into it if we keep with this pathway. I mean, we have a fairly progressive council right now, and I'd like to keep it moving in that direction. But there's the pendulum swing where sometimes, now there's a big attack on the progressive members of the council by a super PAC on the mainland. So those are the things that are going to drive up. There's money out there. There's limited money out there for our budget. And we need to put it into the things that we're all talking about today in this conversation. These are the issues that to me are at the forefront. So I believe we can get there, but it's going to take not just the political will of the people on the council, but the political will of the people in the community. Because we need that backup to make these things happen, to get that funding out there.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about whether the slides that people have been showing are available somewhere. So I suggest that what you do is you send me the links if you have them, and then I'll put them on the Facebook event page. Anyone who's watching on Facebook can go there and see them. And of course, the Facebook, the whole video, the whole event right now is being recorded, so you'll be able to see that there as well. But I think a lot of people want just the slides as well.
Rob, again, I'm sorry, but the concept of electric bikes, I'm a sustainability guy. I am not a pure environmentalist. I'm a sustainability guy. When you're a sustainability guy, you think in systems. I don't think we can think onesie anymore. No matter how good something is, you can't just dwell on a onesie. You got to look at the picture. Transportation is a big, big picture. I consider car traffic to be probably the second greatest threat to the island of Maui. Water is probably the first, and we're not hearing about it enough, but transportation is the second. And if we continue and have to build highways and throw a 6-laner across the poly, we've changed this place forever. Now, much of that is related to tourism, but what the important part is, you break your transportation requirements down to what do people need when. And so much of what we happen, particularly in the tourist trade, is less than 10 miles. Where people can get somewhere. Now, the thing is with electric bikes that makes them very different. We think of things in mileage, but here it's elevation even more so. If everybody was going to ride bikes, they would, but they don't, because nobody wants to ride uphill. And we got almost everywhere you want to go that gets anywhere goes uphill. I was shocked to see that in Seattle, when I was there a year ago, they had 2 companies that are now just like the yellow bikes we heard about in Portland, where you would just drive till you were tired of it, get off, drop it, and go on about your way. And somebody else walks along with their app, punches it in, jumps on the electric bike, and goes. And they were all over the place, and people were just jumping on and riding. Now, if you've got that, maybe we can cut back on our rental car requirement. We've got a rental car requirement that is going to go out the roof if we don't do something quickly. And that is because the new rental facility is driving full occupancy, and that means almost tripling the number of rental cars on Hawaii. If we're doing that, we're tripling our traffic, and what does Maui turn into? So I think we need to look at this thing in a system fashion and build the appropriate response for each one, and then help tourists move towards the things that aren't going to cause much damage to our property, to our island.
Just as a quick rebuttal, I have to disagree that people would ride electric bikes if they could go uphill, because our roads are not safe for biking. we have to build safer roads, and we have to have more bike paths, not just the bike lane in the road. So I think that's the fundamental issue with biking, is we've got to make it safe, because there's plenty of places where it's flat, but it's not safe to ride and people are having accidents. But, you know, that's part of the progress we need to make, is that putting the money into realizing that. And the thing I want to say about the rental cars too, is that we heard, when we were doing the budget this year for the 2021 budget, we heard that the rental cars, you know, because there were so many rental cars just sitting in fields, that the rental companies were going to send 50% of their cars back to Oahu, and which is something like 11,000 cars. So we budgeted for that, because part of the revenue for the budget is the registration fees and the tourist fees for the rental cars. So we cut that out of our budget, just assuming they were going to send those back. So I would not look at that big facility and assume that we're going to fill it up with rental cars. I think we're going to have to find another use for that big airport rental car facility. And, you know, I'm all about that. Let's find something else. I was not in favor of building it, but it's there. And there's also a bill being proposed at the state legislature for the upcoming session to allow the counties to be able to cap the number of rental cars on the island. So I don't know how far that will get, but I think it's a worthy cause. And I would love to work with the youth to show up at the legislature for that one.
Okay, thank you all. I think we're getting towards the end here. I think maybe maybe we can use the big rental facility in Kahului as indoor hockey. You don't have an indoor hockey rink.
There we go.
And then I wanted to share one last slide here, just to show if anyone who still hasn't gotten the picture, that you can sign up at retreehawaii.org/planting, and you can also be a group. You can sign up your school class or your family or your work team. A whole bunch. It's just more fun, and then that way out you can talk about it afterwards. And sometimes you want to come back to the site a year later and see how the plants have been doing. So a lot of reasons to go as a group. With that, I would like to thank everyone for coming, attending, and for our speakers attending from many different sites and offering many different perspectives on this, which we all need, because this is a really tough problem. This is an existential problem. It's the biggest challenge that's ever faced humanity, really. And we have to solve it. If we don't solve it, that's it for the future generations. The earth will survive, but people will not. So thank you all. Aloha, and see you on October 30th.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
you guys were all great. Really
Mahalo.
loved.
Have a
Beth,
good
we're
day,
going to
guys.
follow up with you. Can you
Okay.
send me an email, because I want you to get you working with us.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want it in the chat or just through Rob? I'll do it through Rob.
Yeah, I'll get everybody's contact through Rob,
Okay.
who on this
Great.
panel wants to get more involved.